Back in 2018, Battlecast has just dropped their major update, version 7.0. 7.0 is a pretty funny update. This was back when data mining was not as advanced as today, and people don't find update information that quickly. Most players actually kind of have to explore the game itself to find out what changed. The community had no idea what was in the update, and for a good hour or two after the update dropped, lots of players assume it's just a new chapter in Stories of Legend, and that's about it. There was even some people that just assumes that it's a very empty and barren update. I mean, the final stage of the chapter, the dreaded 800 energy cost stage, has nothing in it. You just spawn like Awakened Bahamut and you win. Like, what was that? Is that really what Ponos have been cooking up for like the 7.0 update, the big 0.0 update? Really? Only, of course, for the players to be jump scared by the true final boss of Stories of Legend. A callback from Moontree Mechabun. And even more surprising is how it's the true end of Stories of Legend and a new beginning of Uncanny Legends. The update also introduced us to the true forms of the Stories of Legend units, as well as the introduction of Relic type enemies, with the first Relic enemies being Relic Bunbun and Relic Doges, debuting together with their new ability, Curse. Curse is probably the one ability that players misunderstood the most. In-game, Curse is described that units afflicted by it cannot inflict negative status effects for a short time, but that's actually a little bit misleading. Effectively, there is truth to this, but that's not at all how Curse works. For one, Curse not only disables status effects, but also some stat multiplier abilities like massive damage or resist. This leads many players to believe that Curse actually disables every abilities and not just debuffs, but that's also not the case. In fact, Curse doesn't actually disable any abilities at all. So, how does Curse work? Well, you know how many units' abilities only affect certain traits that they target? For example, units like RoboCat has a chance to knock back black enemies, Sanzog has a chance to slow floating enemies, and Rocat resists damage from red enemies. When these units are cursed, you would think that they would take away the ability to slow, knock back, and resist, but that's actually not the case. What is actually being taken away by Curse is the target trait, meaning that these units will still retain the ability to knock back, the ability to slow, and the ability to resist, but they don't have a target trait for these abilities to activate. Therefore, they would effectively not be able to use their abilities. However, since all of their abilities are actually still intact, this means that abilities that does not require a target trait will still work as is. This includes abilities such as chance to do waves or search, or double cash, or survive lethal, or debuff resistance abilities such as low resist. These will not be affected by Curse since they are not reliant on target traits. This also even applies to Critical Hit and Metal Killer and even Zombie Killer. Despite Crit and Metal Killer being mainly a metal focused ability, they don't actually require the metal trait on the cat unit to function. Crits will still bypass the metal body ability and Metal Killer will still cut metal enemies HP. Same with Zombie Killer. Despite Z-Killer being a zombie-focused ability, it also doesn't need the zombie targeting to actually work. Killing enemies with a Z-Killer, even if cursed, will still disable zombie enemies from reviving. Again, Curse does not actually remove your abilities, it just removes your target traits. Units with slow versus floating become slow versus nothing. Resist red become resist nothing. This also means that units that have the target-only ability will now target nothing, so that they cannot hit any enemies except for bases. But abilities like Crit, Savage Blow, Wave, Search, Double Cash, Debuff Resistance, and immunities will still be active as they are not reliant on target traits to function. So, now hopefully you understand how Curse works. A lot of people seems to not really understand how Curse works now, and this was also a common question back when Curse was first introduced. Some things don't change. It's like a curse or something. So, let's talk about back when Curse was first introduced in version 7.0. So now you know how Curse works. How does one go around fighting relic enemies? Naturally, if you're against an ability to disable your own abilities, you probably don't want to get cursed yourself. If you're gonna counter relics, you're probably gonna want to bring units with immunity to curse, right? Well, when relics were first introduced, there were barely any units that were focused on anti-relics, except for the true forms of the special Stories of Legend cats. The SOL cats are cats that you unlock as you progress through the legend stages. They are Ururun, A.scene, Lil Nyandem, Mina, Musashi, and finally, Mechabun. All of these units get true form, and to unlock the true form of the SOL units, players will need to farm the dreaded Growing Strange, a level that contains 7 random continuation stages, forcing the player to create a lineup for a very diverse situation. I have a whole video about Growing Strange if you're interested in learning more. For their true forms, they all get general stat boost and something for relics. While some of these units already counter relics, the ones without abilities gain some anti-relic ability. On top of that, all these units in their true forms also gain immunity to curse, allowing them to take hit from relics without getting their abilities disabled. Aside from them, another anti-relics that we got on this update is Rodeo Cat. Rodeo was an anti-black ranged unit with a chance to slow. This update gave him talents, which can give him the relic target, as well as a separate talent for curse resistance. This is not a full immunity, it will simply reduce curse duration if leveled up to a 70%. An update later at version 7.1, we also get the true form of Drama Cat's Slapsticks, which gives them a strong versus relic ability with full curse immunity. At this point, the only other anti-relics in the game are units that have abilities against all traits, or most traits. For example, Mitama and Cyberpunk, that targets all non-traitless and all non-metals respectively, are able to slow relic enemies. However, since they're not a relic-focused unit, these units do not have curse immunity, while the Stories of Legend units do. So some players might think that they want to avoid these units on relic stages. After all, what's the point of units like Mitama or Cyberpunk if they can't slow? Since relic-focused cats generally has curse immunity, the game incentivizes you to use those units over anti-everything units that generally don't have curse immune. However, the incentive to use curse immune units are not actually that great. You see, curse is almost rarely a threat on your team. Not never, of course, but often I would hear people being reluctant to bring certain units into a relic stages simply because they don't have curse immunity, or people assuming that certain units would not perform well in UL because they lack curse immunity, while in reality, this is hardly ever a problem. So, let me explain why curse is often not a threat. When it comes to choosing units for anti-relics, a lot of players often would dismiss anti-relic units that does not have the curse immune abilities. As mentioned before, this is mainly units that has abilities against many traits at once, like Mitama or Cyberpunk. But in reality, this doesn't really matter as much as people think. And this isn't because of like, oh, curse have like RNG and therefore they're not like often appearing or something. No, most relic enemies have guaranteed chance to curse, and the only ones that doesn't is like relic doges or something. The main reason why these curses actually barely matter on your units is something extremely simple. You see, for curse to actually matter, these enemies need to actually hit your cat units in the first place to apply the curse. And you might think, well, I mean, obviously, duh. But this is actually a very big flaw, because this means that you can still freely use units that don't have curse immunity against relics, as long as they just don't get hit. And another thing is that even if they do get hit, it's not like curse lasts forever. If your units get pushed to safety, their curse will wear off eventually, and then they'll be able to do their job like usual. Many relics does have pretty long curse, but it won't last forever. If your units have multiple knockback counts, then they can just get knocked back to safety. And it's important because a lot of the common relic enemies that we have are actually melee or mid-range units. Relic Doge, Sorel, Old Horn, these are all melees. Relic Bun, Emost, they don't have that much range. Once your ranged units gets knocked back by these enemies, they won't just run back and get cursed over and over. Most of your units would be able to just stay outside of their range. Sure, there are some higher range relic enemies, like Loki, a high range backliner with 500 range, or Otom and Puffsly and Golem Sunfitch, all of which have Omni Strike that can pierce through your meat shield units and reach further into your ranged ones. And of course, Loris, which has a huge area attack and extremely far-reaching pierce. Not gonna go into detail into every single relics, but those are most of them that matters. Theoretically, that could even be trouble for your ranged units, right? But even then, majority of these units are not actually that crazy at cursing. Loki, despite having higher range, is just a backliner without a pierce. Most of the time, he will appear in stages being paired with other melee enemies, and your ranged units would not really get hit as long as they don't push inside Loki's range. And sure, if there are no more enemies in the stage, then maybe your units would be forced to get inside their range. But at that point, point, if he's alone, he's just a sitting duck. He's not a threat at all. You've probably already won the stage at that point. Your units probably will only get cursed if you knock the enemies back over and over, but otherwise, the curse will rarely hit your units. And even if it does, your units will probably reposition themselves to safety. And then there's Golem Sunfish. Golem Sunfish has a 3-hit multi-hit where the range extends, and that's where the Omni Strike occurs, but the ability to curse only activates on its first hit, and the first hit itself doesn't have that much range. So, similar to Loki, wouldn't curse your units until you're actually near it. Otherwise, your units will still get hit, but won't not get cursed. And then Otom. Otom is really bad at cursing. Otom's piercing range is actually very small, only adding a 100 range to its original range. As long as you have a good enough meat shielding, the majority of your range units would actually not get hit by the curse. To make it worse, Otom's curse duration is stupidly short. It's only 2 seconds. Even if your units get hit, they would lose the curse very fast. A lot of the times, the curse would just wear off by the next time your cat unit gets to attack. In fact, this curse duration is so low that even if you use Fishman, a melee rusher on Otom, then Fishman would be able to lose the curse immediately after the rebound, to the point where Fishman can just attack Otom over and over without any of the attacks getting cursed. This only works if you don't level your Fishman speed talent too high though. Of course, some of these curses can still matter in certain stages, but they're generally very situational, or just don't matter as much as many player thinks. I would say the one common enemy where curse actually really matters is Loris, since Loris has an actual piercing range that reaches really far. Loris don't have trouble cursing high range cat units with its extremely high pierce, so he doesn't need you to push into their range, he can just push into yours. Not much units are safe from Loris attack, and the curse duration is pretty long too. Pair this guy up with other pusher enemies and your higher range units are almost bound to get cursed. Technically, there are other relic enemies that are good at cursing too, like Dogumaru, Queen Mother V, or Nala, but they're uncommon boss enemies that are used in like 2 stages each. I mean, they're a threat, but they're not common, you know? So really, the only common relic enemies that is actually really good at cursing is Loris, and that's about it. Technically, there's also enemies like Puffington. Puffington also has a pretty big Omni Strike that can hit a huge amount of ranged attackers on your team, and the curse duration is pretty long too. However, Puffington is not exactly a curse unit, more so than it is a damager unit, if that makes sense. But yeah, Puffington curse is actually pretty good, but that's not what most people are worried about when fighting Puffington. The curse is just an extra, you know? Most units would probably be more concerned about getting heavily nuked or killed. I hope that makes sense. Well, actually, there is one more curse enemy that I haven't mentioned. A very special one in that, and that is the Doge-based Curse Cannon. The Doge Curse Cannon is a custom Doge-based enemy that fires a low damaging area attack that'll curse your units for 10 seconds. It replaces the enemy base and therefore will not move and cannot be debuffed. It also has a generally limited range and therefore will only attack if your unit gets into their range. The curse duration has a bit of a gap when the curse will wear off, but the gap isn't that big. So if you're fighting inside the curse cannon's area, you are very likely to be fighting under constant effects of curse, unless your units have curse resistance. Now, while that can be threatening, this can also be countered by simply fighting outside of the curse cannon's range. That would completely nullify the curse problem. A lot of stages that features the Doge Curse Cannon relies on the synergy of the curse itself to become a problem, but luring away outside of the cannon's range can completely destroy the enemy team synergy and allows the stages to be completely broken apart. Granted, this is definitely up there in terms of being cursed being an actual threat compared to like majority of the other enemies in the game, so there's that at least. Looking back at the relic enemies that I deem to be quote-unquote bad at cursing, maybe it's a little bit unfair to judge them in the way that I did though, because I am mainly talking about how most of these enemies are bad when cursing your ranged units, but I've not actually talked that much about melee units. If we're talking about melee units, it's actually a little bit of a different story. Melee units gets more problems when it comes to being cursed. A lot of relic enemies can actually curse your melee units very easily due to their low range. Some melee units still requires abilities to actually work properly, and that can be a problem for them. These mostly includes units archetypes like meat shield, tankers, or rushers. Not only that these units are often inside the cursor's range, but they also don't usually reposition themselves to safety. This can be extremely deadly on many meat shields especially that relies on their their resistance ability to stay in the field longer. And that's the reason why Ramen Cat has the curse resistance talents. Ramen Cat is known to be one of the best anti-Angel in the game because it's an extremely vital meat shield against Angel due to its extremely low cooldown, good price, great base health, plus the ability to only receive 1/4 to 1/5 of damage from Angel enemies. While Ramen's base health is still pretty high, a lot of Angel enemies are extremely hard pushers, and therefore you'd want all of the defense you can get to stall these enemies. But if your Ramen Cat gets cursed even just for a little bit, then your Ramen would receive extreme heavy damage from Angel enemies. And there's actually a surprising amount of Relic plus Angel focus stages in the game. I think Ponos knows how much people rely on Ramen versus Angel, and therefore pairs Angels with Relics a lot, but at the same time still wants to give the player a fighting chance, and that's why they gave Ramen the curse resist talent. That way, at the very least, it won't completely nullify the curse, so the curse can still be a threat, while at the same time still make Ramen not completely useless in Angel stages. It's actually a pretty good move from Ponos to give Ramen curse resist instead of immunity, although I think it would be funnier if Ramen does not get any curse resistance at all. That way the player would have more incentive to try using something else other than Ramen. Unless you're against Otom. Otom's curse duration, man. This thing's curse duration is so incredibly low that even if you don't have the curse resist talents, the curse will still disappear really fast. I've talked about the thing with the Fishman rebound and how Fishman curse would be lifted by the time they attack again, but this is just one example. Even on most short-range debuffer units, if they get knocked back by Otom, there's a good chance that they'd be uncursed by the time they're back in front and is able to attack again. Even units like iCat or Bomber would barely feel the impact of Otom's curse. If anything, many of these units are more worried about Otom's disruptive damage, since they can chip down weaker units, and even then, Otom's damage is very much on the lower side. On units like Ramen, especially with the curse resist, Otom's damage is not really that much of a problem for Ramen, and the curse itself is barely noticeable. Otom's curse is just so useless. But that's really just Otom. Most other relic curse duration can usually last like 5 or 10 seconds or even longer, so their curse can actually really screw some units up, and even units with curse resistance can still feel the curse. And with how easy it is to hit melee units, many melee units, especially tankers and meat shields, can really feel the effect of curse if they really rely on their ability to stay alive, and these are where curse can become truly terrifying. Curse is also generally significantly worse when you pair those curse with enemies with different traits. In a pure relic focus stages, while curse can be a threat at times, you generally would never really need to be worried about curse, since majority of the anti-relic focused units in the game are almost always imbued with curse immunity. But this is usually not the case for any other units that are not anti-relics. Non-anti-relics rarely have any curse immunity on them, so if they have to work on a mixed trait relic stage, they can be under the threat of curse. And this can be a real problem if the relics are paired with enemies whose counters are usually short-range cat units. These include something like boar variants. Boar variants are usually better countered with common rare debuffer units, and most of them don't really have a high range. It can be a huge problem if these units gets cursed. Specialized meat shields and specialized tankers also often would not really work on these units because they are prime target for many curse enemies, and if they lose their curse, then they would just get shredded extremely fast. So then that begs the question, how does one counter relics without curse immunity? When it comes to dealing with curse, of course you probably want a curse immune or something. Like Octopus, who is a floating tanker, does have the curse immune talent, and also the aforementioned Ramen has the curse resist talent. But then what about units that don't have curse immunity? What if there's a Razorback in the stage, but there's a relic enemy backing Razorback up? Razorback is usually extremely difficult to deal with as it has extremely powerful pushing power and a great bulk of health, and even deals double damage when it's at half health. Normally, the only viable counter to Razorback is Bomber Cat, a unit with guaranteed freeze against black enemies. And I've also talked about Bomber and Razorback in another video if you want to learn more about this. However, Bomber is kind of a short-range, mid-range unit, which could make it very risky to use with Curse around. Sure, you can use Talented Rodeo Cat, since he was originally already an anti-black unit, and he was given the Curse Resistance talents too. So theoretically, he should be able to work on Razorback even under the threat of Curse. But honestly, even with the talents, Rodeo is still a very inconsistent unit, and I think realistically most people just wouldn't want to spend their NP to upgrade Rodeo's talents. So then how would you normally want to deal with this sort of situation? Well, the answer to this situation would heavily depend on the stage actually. So far there has been a couple of stages that features Razorback paired with Curse. There is a stage where he's paired with the Doge Curse Cannon and another stage where he's paired with Otom. If we look at these stages, most people would actually still bring Bombercat in these stages. To deal with the Otom stage, all you need is just proper meat shielding to protect Bombercat. Remember that although Otom has piercing range, the piercing is extremely short and Bomber still has a pretty decent standing range to be able to safely hit Razorback as long as he's protected by a meat shield in front of them. That way, Otom's pierce would not hit Bombercat. Alternatively, you can also lure all the way back to your base and have your Bombercat to be protected by your own cat base. Due to how Omni Strike works, Otoms will not be able to hit anything that is behind your cat base, so your Bomber would be able to stay there safely. I have a video explaining more in depth about this and about how good the cat base can be as a tanker. If you want to learn more, you can watch that video. That being said, Otom's role here is more of a disruptor than a cursor because again, Bomber has low health, so if Otom hits it, there's a good chance that your Bomber could die. But if your Bomber survives a hit, then the curse would basically just disappear near immediately, so whatever. Once again, Otom's curse is near useless. So what about the other stage? The one with Razorback and the Doge Curse Cannon. For this stage, you can just, once again, lure away and fight outside of the curse-based cannon and just perma-freeze Razorback there. Sure, the stage also features many other black enemies that you have to deal with, but many general anti-black units have been so powerful that we can still afford to lose like 90% of the space in the stage and deal with the black enemies safely, as long as we don't have to deal with the threat of curse. But this is just this specific stage, because there are some other stages where you might not really be able to afford to lose space. If you lure away in every Doge Cursed Cannon stage, you are potentially risking getting pushed into your base and dying very quickly. Sometimes you just can't afford to lure. In that case, there are still more other ways to counter these sort of situations. You might want to build your team around more generalist type units that don't rely on target-based abilities. Now, this doesn't mean that you straight up don't use units that have target-based abilities. You just need to use ones that aren't going to be completely straight up useless if their abilities are being temporarily taken away. More generalist mid-rangers like Pizza or Seafarer or even like Cameraman can still work really well. Even if they're going to perform worse when their abilities are being taken away, they can still deal a good amount of damage towards the enemies even when being cursed. Or you can just units that don't rely on any abilities at all to be good, like Can or Voltercat. Technically, Can would lose their slow versus red and alien, and Volter would also lose her slow versus zombie ability, but they're not really required to function as their stats will remain intact, and stuff like Can's double cash talent as well as Volter's zombie killer and Volter's savage blow ability will still be active even if they're cursed. Another way to counter curse is to use units that are speedy and spammable, like Courier and Fishman. Remember when I talk about how melee units are generally more in danger to being cursed, and then I mainly just talk about meat shields and tankers? Well yeah, I didn't talk about rushers there, because rushers often would still work even if the stage is heavy on curse. In fact, sometimes rushers are one of the best units that you can pick against many curse stages. This would heavily depend on what kind of curse enemies you're up against, but many rushers can work really well even on some of the more scarier curse enemies like Loris, Cursed Cannon, or even bosses like Queen Mother V, and even Dogumaru. The thing about these enemies is that even though their curse duration is long, their attack rate is relatively slow. Because of that, if you use some speedier units, then potentially you can just time your units to make sure that they enter the fray right after the enemy has just attacked. That way, they'd be able to land some hits before getting cursed or dying or whatever. Or in the case of something against like Queen Mother V or Loris, which has blind spot, then sometimes you would just be able to completely avoid getting hit by the curse entirely. Loris can be very deadly on your ranged units, but will generally not actually do too well against your short range units, especially fast ones. Many Loris stages can be countered by using more melee units, units to avoid getting cursed by Loris. Otom is sometimes also very rushable if you can separate it alone, especially since it's part floating. It can get mowed down hard by Fishman, and Otom's useless curse doesn't really protect itself against Fishman's rebounds. Also, I have a video talking about why rushers are probably one of the most powerful role in the game. If you want to learn more, you can watch that video. Anyways, point is, there's a lot of ways to counter curse. You get the idea by now. You don't have to bring curse immune units. You can still use units that works even if they're cursed, or using units that can just completely avoid getting cursed. Now, those are curse from enemies. So now let's move on to talking about curse from cat units. Okay, so curse on cat units. Cat units eventually got the ability to deliver curse towards enemies. Cursing enemies also has the same behavior as curse on cats, where they would not remove abilities, rather they would remove target traits. Of course, enemies don't actually have like target traits exactly, but just assume that essentially what that means is that enemies have a natural cat target trait. This will still essentially disable the same thing that cat units gets disabled by, mostly debuffs like slow or freeze, but excluding immunities or certain abilities like wave or crit. Something funny though is that since curse itself is a debuff, this means that cat unit that has a curse against relic ability is able to disable a relic enemy's curse. Additionally, remember how most relic focused units tend to have curse immune? This means that units with curse against relic usually would not get cursed back and would be able to curse the enemies first. Get a taste of your own curse. Curse can be extremely powerful if you're using it against specific enemies or specific abilities. One of the great ways to use curse is, well, the aforementioned cursing a relic to disable their own curse, but most relic enemies can still function even if their own curse gets taken out. Instead, the ability that is probably the best to disable from the enemy side is Toxic. Toxic is an ability that instantly cuts down a certain unit's health by percentage of their max health. This would cripple tankers instantly, and most toxic enemies can 2 or 3 shot every cat units in the game without toxic immunity. Although we don't have a cat unit that does toxic, we do know that toxic as an enemy ability still needs like a target trait to actually function, so toxic will get disabled if they are cursed. This can completely devastate most toxic based enemies like Gobbles, Big Peng Z, or Papu, because their base damage is actually really small. They heavily rely on their toxic ability to deal any sorts of damage. Cursing these toxic based enemies would remove a gigantic chunk of their usual damage. You're basically taking away the entire reason why these enemies are scary at the first place. Sure, there are a couple of enemies with toxic that can still deal good damage, but you're still cutting a huge chunk of their actual damage with curse. Aside from toxic, there's a lot of enemies that are designed around purely debuff. Some of the most well-known abilities being Henry or Crockley, which can permafreeze and permaslow your units respectively. Similar to many toxic enemies, these enemies are designed to be a pure support to land debuffs. They don't really have that much damage, so if you curse them, they would be completely useless. Curse usage isn't strictly limited to enemies with just pure debuffs though. Some enemies might have debuffs as just an extra, and while disabling these abilities don't completely shut down these enemies, it can still help you in many different ways. For example, Professor A, which has a chance to slow your units. Since Professor A is generally better countered using melee units, you'd want your melee units to get close and personal on Professor A. But Professor A's slow ability can stop your melee units from advancing or getting close to it. If you're unlucky, many melee units would just straight up not be able to approach Professor A. But if you're able to curse Professor A even just temporarily and disable the chance to slow, then your melee units would be able to approach Professor A without the worry of getting slowed by RNG. Many other example where curse would also help is again Slipnir to disable the knockback, Wing Piggy to disable the weaken, or bosses like Baku to disable the freeze, or Queen Bee to disable the slow. So there's actually quite a lot of applications for curse. Sometimes it can completely shut down certain enemies, while at other times it can still help against making just certain enemies to be slightly easier to deal with. That being said, it's not quite all rainbows and sunshines. Most of the things that I've said here are kind of theoretical, let's just say. A more unrealistic, optimal way of using curse. However, when it comes to the reality, it's usually not as good or as simple as it sounds. So let's talk about the more realistic and uglier side of curse. You see, curse has one simple problem. You need to actually hit the enemies for the curse to apply. Huh, where have I heard that one before? Yeah, so you know how most relic enemies are not great at cursing because they have a hard time hitting cat units that matters? That's also a problem that exists on the cat side. You see, a big chunk of cursed cat units are not great at cursing. A big factor when it comes to knowing whether a cursed unit is good or not heavily depends on what enemies you're targeting or what enemies that can be targeted. That means the target traits from your cat units can really make or break whether a unit's cursed ability is good or not. Every trait in the game always have at least some enemies worth cursing, but not every traits are built the same. Some traits are more relevant than others when it comes to being cursed. I would say some of the more relevant traits that you'd want to curse would be something along the lines of relics, aliens, and angels. Most relics have curse, which is always relevant to curse back. Most aliens don't always have some relevant abilities, but majority of star aliens has the ability to warp your units, temporarily putting your units out of battle and sending them backwards. Warp itself is not that bad, but at the very least it makes it so that curse can actually affect most star aliens in some way. We'll get into that a little bit more later. Angel is actually quite a funny one because there's quite a lot of angel enemies that actually has relevant abilities. You can disable knockback from Slipnir, Gokuraku, and Lackey. You can disable Wing Piggy's Weaken, or Exial's Warp, or even Papu's Toxic. So there's actually a decent amount of angel enemies that you can realistically curse. Sure, there are other traits that also have enemies with relevant abilities, like Reds have Professor Ace with Slow, or Okame's Knockback, or Deonil's Freeze. But the problem is most of these enemies have very high range or very high piercing, and that makes them very difficult to actually hit. Most of the units in the game already have trouble hitting them at the first place, let alone specifically curse units. Consistency is extremely important when it comes to curse, because curse only will actually have an effect when it is applied when the enemy is actually attacking. It's very similar in the idea with Weaken as well, which I've also already covered in my previous Weaken video. But yeah, consistency is very important when it comes to curse. So now that we know all that, what is the deal with a lot of cat units and why are they bad at cursing? So let's take some example of cursed cat units. Bakery Cat, one of the first curse units that we got. He has good piercing, but it's only single target. He's also extremely slow with unsafe standing range, and he usually just tend to not stay in the field for that long. He does have 3 target traits, but no actual enemies that he can hit. And he does have LD, so he does have piercing range to hit enemies that are further away, but it heavily relies on Stepping Stone, and he's only single target, so that he could just sometimes miss the enemies you want to target. His alien targeting is probably one of his better aspects since it can stop some enemies warp, but he has a huge blind spot that he might sometimes just miss. Plus, he's often just not really worth using compared to a lot of other anti-alien units like Seafarer to freeze the aliens or whatever units that can just rush aliens down quickly. His zombie targeting is also not too great because he's not really able to hit any zombies worth cursing, with the exception of maybe Big Peng Z, since Big Peng Z is a toxic unit with low base damage. BPZ, despite having big pierce, also have a relatively low standing range, so Bakery can actually hit him with relative ease, and doing so will cripple BPZ. But BPZ is just an event enemy and is not really that hard in the first place, but I would still count that as like a valid usage, you know? Bakery Cat's true form does fix a lot of his problems, but we'll get into that later. Another unit is Little Flying Cat. Little Flying has a talent to curse his targets, zombies and relics, from talents. Similar to Bakery, his range also doesn't allow him to actually hit anything worth cursing when it comes to zombies, and majority of the relics that's actually worth cursing are also very high range enemies that he can't really hit easily. And even if he can hit the enemies, his chance of curse is only 20% and only lasts for 2 seconds. I don't know why Ponos just gave Little Flying such terrible talent for some reason. Probably because he stole from a McDonald's cash register when it was still a bird. Then we got Brainwashed Axe and Brainwashed Cow. Once again, melee units can't really hit their targets that well. Brainwashed Island is probably one of the better ones because despite being melee, he's a proper tanker and therefore can hit higher range enemies by tanking through them, but he also only targets zombies. At the very least, he's at least better than Little Flying in this regards. Brainwashed Island isn't bad, but I just think his curse is not what you would really use him for. It's just an extra bonus on top of an already amazing unit. So far, my examples have been mainly non-Ubers, but even then some Ubers are also not that amazing at cursing. Papaluga has guaranteed curse on every trait, which theoretically should be great for cursing, but Papaluga does not have piercing range. His range isn't that low, but it's not high enough to be able to curse many enemies safely. And he does have mini-wave talent, but his mini-wave is chance-based and it's only level 3, so it doesn't actually extend his reach by much. On top of that, his curse isn't really permanent. It does have a noticeable gap. Chun Hunters has a guaranteed chance to curse angel enemies and even has mini-wave, so it technically has a piercing range. But the wave length is really small, so the piercing is nearly non-existent. It also only targets 2 traits. But even then, despite all that, honestly, Papaluga and Shitakiri both actually are still decent at cursing, all things considered. Papaluga's range isn't that big, but it's still pretty decent, enough to be able to outrange a lot of enemies, and isn't restricted by target traits or RNG. And Chun Hunters, the curse is still guaranteed, the mini-wave is still a nice little extra, and his target traits are actually pretty relevant, so it's not all bad. That being said, a good cursor and a good units are two very different things. The lack of piercing range really limits what enemies they can hit, and their general lack of stats makes it so that they're not that great outside of purely cursing. Curse is better as an extra ability rather than the main focus of a unit. If your units are able to curse well but don't really have any qualities outside of cursing, then chances are it might not really be that great of a unit. They probably will still work on very specific enemies in very specific stages, but outside of cursing enemies, if you want them to be a good unit, then you probably want them to still be able to contribute into the battle, even if there's only a few enemies that gets affected by the curse. And that is why units like Castley the Bane is top tier. I've talked extremely extensively about Castley the Bane, or Dastley for short, in a video a long time ago. You can check that out if you want to learn more about Dastley's hellish reign. But essentially, Dastley counters so many problems when it comes to curse units. For one, Dastley's curse targets all trait and is guaranteed, and lasts long enough to perma-curse enemies thanks to her search extension. Plus, she has a nice standing range and great LD pierce with a search that lasts a good amount of time. Most enemies can be easily targeted by Dastley's range. Hitting enemies to curse them is not a problem at all for Dastley. She can reliably permanently curse most enemies with no problems. And the final best thing, the craziest part of all, is that her stats are so absurdly powerful that even if she doesn't have the cursing ability, she would still be a top tier unit. Her damage and health stats are just so ridiculously absurd and way above the standard of most units. Her curse is just an extra added bonus, and even without it, she would still just kill most enemies all by herself. So it just makes it even worse the fact that Dastley is also probably one of the best cursor too. There's very little reason to actually use any other curse units when you have Dastley on the team. Not only she's already a top tier unit, her curse itself is also top tier. She already outclasses most curse units. Of course, Dastley is not the only culprit here. We also got crazy units like Esoteric Uriel, Uriel's true form, that's just also incredibly busted. Uriel's true form is also in the same boat as Dastley, since aside from being really good at cursing his targets, being Relics and Akus, he's also just an extremely incredible powerful unit even outside of his curse. He doesn't need the curse to be good, the curse is just a nifty extra. Even without the curse, he's already single-handedly able to deal with Relics and Akus from its ridiculous stat number and near permaslow with his search. Well, those are amongst like one of the super busted units, but there are still some curse units that are decent without being like busted, you know? I don't know how controversial this is, but I think Chun Hunters is actually still pretty neat. It's not like a great generalist unit, but for what it's worth, they have a purpose on a decent amount of enemies and stages where they can actually perform pretty well for both the curse and the knockback ability that they have. Also, you know, the fact that they have a 1-slot research combo, which is really good. Watch my research combo video if you want to learn why research combo is so good, but even outside of that, it's still pretty decent as a unit. Another example is Bakery's true form, Fried Chicken Cat, which actually gains some pretty good buffs. He has range and stat increase, plus finally getting area attack, allows him to be used somewhat of an LD mid-range generalist with an added Z-killer bonus. The curse itself is also way better, as he gains a new relic target to cursing the curse cursor. Plus the extra range allows it to hit more enemies, and the area attack makes it consistent so he just doesn't miss his targets. It's a decent Z-killer generalist with very reliable curse on top of that to disable many relevant enemies' abilities like Oldstridge Toxic and Alien's Warps. Also, fun fact, did you know Fried Chicken Cat being a curse unit is actually a reference to a real-life event called Curse of the Colonel, like KFC's Colonel Sanders Colonel. In 1985, fans of the Hanshin Tigers, a Japanese baseball club, threw a statue of Colonel Sanders into the river, and ever since then, Hanshin Tigers proceeded to never win a single Japan series until the curse is finally broken 38 years later, when the Hanshin Tigers finally won the 2023 Japan series. This was huge news when it happened. There was even someone cosplaying as Colonel Sanders being thrown into the river for a funny bit. Fried Chicken itself got its form in 2024, so it's still relatively recent-ish at the time. Really cool that they made this form of a curse unit for an actual curse of a real-life event. Very funny. But anyways, those units aside, there's still one more cursor that I really want to talk about. Probably one of the most underutilized cursor that's actually really good at their job, and it's not even a cat unit. Instead, let's talk about the Curse Blast Cannon. Curse Blast is one of the custom cannon head that you can build on Ototo's workshop. Cursed Cannon fires a singular beam that goes across the entire stage, which instantly puts a curse debuff on every enemies that are not immune to it. It does exactly about what you expect. I have mentioned that one of the aspects on what makes Curse good is consistency, but Curse Cannon only lasts for a short while and can only be fired every once in a while. Despite that, the nature of Curse being a cannon has a lot of advantages. The fact that it can curse every enemies in the stage no matter the length, allowing you to curse very hard to reach enemies, can be a really big deal. And the fact that you can fire it anytime you want means that you can time it on specific moments to disable specific attacks. One example of a great application of Curse Cannon is floor 45 of both Heavenly and Infernal Tower. In this stage, there's Baku and Queen Bee, who can do freeze and slow respectively. The general strategy for this stage is to build up a stack inside of Queen Bee's blind spot to be able to knock Baku back over and over to make sure that she doesn't attack. But there might be times where, in the process of building your stack, where Queen Bee might be able to land a hit on your unit, or Baku might be able to finish an attack and do a freeze on you. In these sort of cases, you can utilize the Curse Cannon to make sure that your units would not get slowed or frozen even if your units gets hit by them. The curse is temporary, sure, but the nature of the instantaneous curse can be great for a panic button and allows you to put enough units inside of Queen Bee's blind spot by making sure that they don't get slowed or frozen, which can initialize the stack you're building up and snowball the entire stage. The same idea can also be applied to a lot of Henry or Croakley stages, as these stages would often require you to build up a stack inside of their blind spot as quickly as possible. The Curse Blast, although temporary, allows your units to avoid getting permafrozen or permaslowed for at least one of the attack cycle, which can actually be way more than enough to push hard into the enemy's blind spot with whatever units you're bringing. You're not entirely disabling the enemy's ability throughout the entire stage, but that one temporary curse can sometimes be all you need to make your strategy work. You can essentially waste a debuffer's enemy's attack with Curse Cannon in a kind of like a similar idea with Weaken, which I've talked about in my Weaken video. Curse Cannon is generally often very overlooked despite how good it can be. I think it's mainly just because, like, you know, other cannons like Freeze or Holy Blast are just way too good, and so people probably wouldn't really want to build the Curse Cannon. That's probably a topic for another day. But yeah, Curse Cannon can be really great, and Curse in general can also just be great and all, but a lot of the times it does really depends on the enemies that you're facing. Like I've mentioned, there are a couple of times where cursing certain enemies can be extremely helpful, or other times where cursing enemies can help just a little bit, and there might be times where cursing won't do anything if the enemies don't really rely on any abilities at all. But did you know there's also times where you actively do not want to curse enemies? So let's talk about that. Cursing enemies, that sounds great, right? I mean, why wouldn't you want to just take away the enemy's ability to apply debuff on your units? Well, there's actually several instances in certain stages where you might just want to let enemies do their debuffs on you in order to help yourselves. Knockback and Warp are abilities that enemies might be able to do that might not be necessarily bad on your units. Knockback, which can push your units backward, can be rather disruptive in a lot of times, but depending on the situation, it might also also help you. Knocking back your ranged unit allows them to reposition on a more safer spot in the field without needing to use up their knockback count, essentially minimizing the damage that they take. Warp is also in a similar vein, as Warp also usually just puts your units backwards. Sometimes Warp can be disruptive for your defensive units for a bit, or even like filling up your cat limit, but in the same vein as Knockback, Warp can also sometimes position your units to safety. When being phased out, your cat units are essentially invulnerable too, which can actually help your cat units to basically dodge certain enemies' attacks. Well, if you're lucky enough, that is. Sure, there may be also like Gardenil, which can warps your units forward instead of backwards. This can bring your cat units to a more dangerous position unprotected by your other units, but there's also other times where you'd want to warp certain units forward in order to just skip through the enemy's front lines and just go hit like higher range backliner enemies, or sometimes even just straight up cheese the base. That being said, this is probably kind of an unrealistic example because you hardly would be able to curse Gardenil, since Gardenil have super high range. But I'm just putting it out there as an example, you know, maybe just to make sure you don't use curse cannon on them randomly. So let's bring in a more realistic example on when using curse can be really bad for you. Let's go to the stage Wonders of Nature. This stage features Yukan, a powerful waver enemy paired with Emost, which can knock back and slow your units. If you play the stage normally, then you'll realize that the combination of these two enemies are actually an anti-synergy. Emost's relentless knockback and slow will constantly push your meat shields and melee units away. This might sound bad, but it's actually very helpful for you, as this will actually allow your meat shields to not get hit by Yukan. Yukan has a somewhat long attack startup, so with Emost constantly knocking and slowing your melee units back, Yukan will rarely ever land its hit. Normally, if Yukan is able to land a hit, then he would be able to deliver a devastating wave attack. But Emost's knockback and slow would just make it so that Yukan would miss over and over, and even if Yukan lands a hit, then you could just use a wave blocker. One of the most accessible wave blocker is Octopus, but Octopus is a melee unit. Normally, this means that Octopus would just go into the enemy's range and die really quickly, but thanks to Emost's knockback and slow, Octopus will be kept alive for a much longer amount of time, since he would just often chill outside of Yukan's range because of the slow. So even if Yukan lands a hit on your meat shield, any waves that were done are pretty much always going to be blocked. There's always going to be an Octopus just out of range. So then that begs the question, what if you curse Emost? If you're bringing a curse unit for Emost in this stage, then you've probably just shot yourself in the foot. Emost doesn't really deal that much damage, and therefore many of your meat shields or melee units would not really die that easily from it. Because of that, many of your melee or meat shield units are able to push into Emost's range without dying as long as the Emost is cursed. But this also means that Yukan would be able to land hits more accurately, and if he lands a hit, then maybe your Octo might be able to protect you, but since your Octo would not get knocked back and slow by Emost, then there's a good chance that Yukan would just kill the Octo, or Emost would kill the Octo, and in that case, there's nothing protecting your units, and most of your non-wave immune units would just immediately die. You see how using Curse can actually be a detriment here. Of course, the stage is still very possible even if you bring Curse units with you, but the stage would essentially just be harder if you bring Curse units. Wow, I'm glad I can just slander Dashley in this video, that's crazy. But anyways, an extremely similar example also shows up in Area of the Princess, but I think the idea is very similar with this stage, so I'll pick another stage. COTC 3 Big Bang and its boss, Cat God 3. Cat God 3 has a 3-hit multi-hit on his attack. The first hit will do a stomp that deals low damage, but will also do a wave attack and warp your units away. His final hit of the multi-hit actually deals a lot of damage and could easily kill most of your units. Cursing Cat God here means that you are taking away his warp in the first hit, which is not great, since his first warp will actually save most of your units from getting hit by the actual strong third hit. If you let Cat God do his thing, then most of your units would be able to survive for a long amount of time because they would get constantly warped to safety. But if you do decide to curse Cat God for whatever reason, then chances are units would just keep on melting from Cat God's third hit, and that can be really bad. I mean, sure, the stage itself is not really hard, but you know, that's besides the point. The point is, sometimes using curse can just be a detriment. You're just better off not using curse in these sort of situations. But yeah, I think think that's more or less all I wanted to talk about when it comes to Curse. Curse is a very super polarizing ability. It's sometimes really good, it sometimes does nothing, which is fine, but sometimes it can just be detrimental. And there's still a lot of players that misunderstood how Curse works or what Curse can or cannot do. It's a very interesting ability for what it's worth. It's pretty cool to see which enemies care or don't care about getting cursed, or situations where Curse will be a disadvantage. But it feels like there's not a lot of people that discusses about Curse in the community. Not entirely sure why that's the case. I feel like maybe some players just don't really come any cursing units that are good, or the exact opposite, that maybe some players are just so used with Curse that they just don't remember it existing as an ability because they're always going to bring a Curse unit. Oh, I wonder why that's the case. Oh yeah, it's because of Dastly. It's always Dastly. Freaking Dastly users. Anyways, that's all I wanted to say, I think. I can't think of like an inspirational speech for this topic, I'm sorry. Hey, if you're like feeling useless in life, at least you're not as useless as Otom's Curse. Yeah, well, that's not really inspirational, but you know, anyways, as usual, I hope you learn a thing or two. If you have any questions or if you think I missed something cool about Curse, leave them in the comments. Like, subscribe, whatever. Wingding Gaster that bell. I make many other Battlecast videos and some videos about indie games and whatnot. Be sure to check those out. And that's all. Catch you another time. See ya.